Olá, o programa Direito Sem Fronteiras da TV Justiça exibe uma série de entrevistas com embaixadores e representantes de embaixadas de outros países no Brasil. Nós queremos saber o que eles pensam sobre algumas das principais questões mundiais e especialmente como avaliam as relações com o nosso país. E a nossa entrevista de hoje é com Vusi Mavimbela, embaixador da África do Sul. Ele tem 69 anos, é graduado em Ciências Sociais e Radiojornalismo. Lutou pela liberdade, pela democracia e contra o apartheid e serviu a África do Sul em várias funções no primeiro escalão do governo do país, como a Presidência da República e a Agência Nacional de Inteligência. Vusi Mavimbela tem também uma longa carreira diplomática. Foi embaixador da África do Sul no Zimbábue, no Egito e desde 2001 no Brasil. Ambassador, thank you for having us here today and thank you for this interview.
Welcome.
Embaixador, o Brasil e outros países emergentes sempre cobram mais contribuição dos países ricos para o enfrentamento da crise climática mundial. Qual é a política da África do Sul para a questão ambiental?
You know, South Africa in Africa is the biggest polluter. So we've got a responsibility, at least in terms of the African continent, to show that we're serious about fighting climate change and the pollution in the world. And as you might know, South Africa has been selected by a number of industrialized countries to be an example of how just transition can happen by pledging to mobilize the funds, the money to help South Africa to transform. But in terms of the entirety of the world, in South Africa and the developing countries, we're not the biggest polluters. The biggest polluters have been the industrialized countries. They are industrialized because they've polluted the world. So they've got a responsibility to actually help the developing countries that needs to fight climate change. They've got the responsibility to support that in terms of skills transfer, in terms of funds, and so on and so forth. So that's what the just transition financing is about, which South Africa is calling upon, which South Africa is campaigning for. So we do believe that the industrialized countries have got the responsibility to support the emerging countries, the emerging industrial countries, to actually deal with the issue of climate change and pollution.
E que resultados a África do Sul espera da COP30 a ser realizada aqui no Brasil?
You know, one of the issues that COP is dealing with is exactly the just transition financing. South Africa will be hosting the G20 next year. And of course, we'll be taking over from Brazil. We are understudying Brazil about how it is hosting the COP, the G20, and what the issues that they are putting on the agenda. We believe that one of the issues that should be put on the agenda very strongly is the issue of financing the just transition for the developing countries, including South Africa. So if you talk about COP30, would like that there should be a serious discussion about just transition financing.
Há uma preocupação crescente em todo o mundo com o papel desempenhado pelas redes sociais. Como é que isso tem afetado a África do Sul?
Well, social media is a phenomenon that affects all of us. It affects us positively, but also it affects us negatively. Positively because there's a lot of education that is on the platform of the social media. And it's easy to reach the greatest number of people using social media. So even governments of the day use social media in order to propagate and to educate. But on the other side, there are those people who want to use the social media to sabotage the progress that is being made. So in South Africa's case, for instance, we encourage social media, we encourage free speech, But at the same time, there are limitations to social media. There are limitations to what you can say. For instance, in South Africa, you've got laws that are against hate speech. So you can't use social media in order to fan violence, in order to promote racism, in order to promote conflict between ethnic groups or national groups. So there are positives, but also there are negatives, and you need to limit the negatives. And one of the things that are important is the agenda that Brazil has put on the table. The agenda that Brazil has put on the table addresses, to a very large extent, the challenges that face the countries of the South, the developing countries. So when South Africa takes over next year, we'll take some of those agendas to G20 in South Africa, but also we'll add our own agendas that we think might be specific to the African continent, but also adding to the agenda that Brazil has also put forward.
O Brasil elencou 3 temas prioritários a serem debatidos sob a sua presidência do G20: combate à fome, pobreza e desigualdade, desenvolvimento sustentável e reforma da governança global. Como é que a África do Sul deve se posicionar sobre esses temas?
All those issues that Brazil has put on the table are issues that cannot be resolved within the presidency of Brazil, of the G20. They'll have to be carried forward. So South Africa will carry those agendas forward, and the country that will take over from South Africa will carry them forward. But of course, South Africa will add its own perspectives onto the agendas. For instance, you talk about sustainable development. We talked earlier about just transition. I mean, just transition is also about sustainable development, because if you don't deal with the issue of just transition, you can't ensure sustainable development.
O BRICS tenta evitar o dólar como moeda única para transações internacionais. A África do Sul já faz negócios com outros países sem usar o dólar? É possível a criação de uma moeda internacional que substitua a moeda dos Estados Unidos?
No, there are discussions within BRICS and the expanded BRICS about alternative means of trade and payment systems in the world. Largely this has been engendered by the position that America has taken of basically weaponizing the dollar. That if they don't agree with you or you don't agree with them, they can actually squeeze you on the dollar. They can actually freeze your assets and freeze your dollars, like they've already done to some of the countries. So it becomes important for BRICS to begin to discuss, is there an alternative that we can have so that we're free from the threat of the country that owns the dollars threatening us whenever we disagree. Look, for instance, the issue of Palestine and Israel. South Africa has taken a position, and in America, they are trying to put in place laws that are going to punish South Africa for its position on Israel and Palestine. So what if tomorrow they decide we are going to freeze South African assets? We are going to freeze South African dollars in America. So what becomes our alternative? So it's important to discuss an alternative currency.
A China se tornou uma potência econômica e militar inquestionável e tem presença internacional cada vez maior. É o maior parceiro comercial do Brasil, por exemplo. No caso da África, a China é o país que mais investe no continente desde 2013. E a África do Sul é um dos 5 países que mais recebem investimentos chineses. Quais as consequências econômicas e políticas dessas relações?
You know, one of the things that the developing countries are crying for and they want to encourage is a multipolar world. We don't want a unipolar world where one country dictates to everybody. It is important that the power balances are balanced in the world. It is important that we've got choices about trade, we've got choices about political alignments. So the growth of China is a positive thing, because we are moving away from the past decades when we had a unipolar world centered on America, but we're going to have a multipolar world. So it's something good for us because we've got a choice of partners we can have, we've got a choice about trade. Nobody can dictate to us because we don't have an alternative.
Embaixador, que reformas são necessárias na Organização das Nações Unidas na avaliação da África do Sul?
No, it's definitely part of the agenda of the BRICS, agenda of Brazil, agenda of South Africa, to push for the reform of the United Nations institutions. Not just the United Nations, but even its own institutions, that they need to be reformed, because right now they are dominated by a few countries. For instance, look at the veto power of some of the countries. Look at what has happened in Palestine. The rest of the world want a ceasefire in Palestine, but one country, because it has got a veto, can veto what the world wants to do. So we need to deal with that and remove that dominance of one power or a few powers to dictate to the whole world. So the reform of the United Nations is important.
E como a África do Sul vê a proposta de ampliação do Conselho de Segurança da ONU e a reivindicação brasileira de ter um assento permanente no Conselho?
Well, the United Nations will have to discuss what format. We are talking about reforming the United Nations, but the details of what form it takes, whether it expands, but definitely we need more representation, especially by the developing countries, the countries of the South, even in the Security Council. They must have more say, and their voice must have more weight in the United Nations and the Security Council. But the exact format at the end of the day will have to be worked out.
A África do Sul tem uma importância internacional, especialmente no continente africano. O seu país também reivindica o direito de ter assento permanente no Conselho de Segurança da ONU, não é isso?
We're not claiming for ourselves, we're claiming for the developing countries. That the blocks that we belong to, the countries that are marginalized and the continents that are marginalized must have more say. As to who at the end of the day will sit there, it will have to be discussed amongst those countries who can represent us better. So we're not claiming that South Africa will represent all the people of the South and countries of the better than another country. That will have to be discussed.
O direito a veto dos membros permanentes do Conselho deveria ser mantido?
That's what I was talking about. We need to reform so that we don't have a few countries having the veto. We must find another mechanism to deal with finding a consensus within the Security Council rather than having one power in one country vetoing everybody else because they don't agree.
Embaixador, existem também propostas de reformas em outros organismos internacionais, como o Fundo Monetário Internacional e o Banco Mundial. Como é que a África do Sul enxerga essas propostas?
That's exactly what I said earlier on, that we're not just talking about the UN sitting in New York that needs to be reformed, but even the institutions of the United Nations, they themselves need to be reformed so that they're able to afford all countries and all economic and political blocs the opportunity to influence decisions in the favor of everybody else.
Embaixador, os Estados Unidos decidiram obrigar o TikTok a transferir o controle da empresa para cidadãos estadunidenses. Como é que a África do Sul avalia essa atitude?
I mean, we all have got TikTok. In South Africa, we've got TikTok. And as I said earlier on, the social media has got positive sides and negative sides. TikTok has got its own positive sides of enlightening, especially the young people, about what is happening in the world, which some of the information is being suppressed by some of the countries. So it become a positive thing. So if American legislators, they decide that they want to ban TikTok or nationalize TikTok, it's for the Americans to deal with that. Let them express themselves on that, whether it's something good or something bad. But in our countries, we recognize that there are things that are positive about the social media, but also there are things that might be negative, that in one way or another should be limited and controlled.
Nós vamos a um breve intervalo. Na volta, você confere a segunda parte da nossa entrevista aqui no Direito Sem Fronteiras. É um instante. Estamos de volta com o Direito Sem Fronteiras e hoje o nosso convidado é o embaixador da África do Sul, Vusi Mavimbela. Embaixador, em janeiro, a África do Sul acusou formalmente Israel de cometer genocídio contra o povo palestino e pediu à Corte Internacional de Justiça que ordenasse o fim das operações militares. E no fim de maio, a Corte ordenou que Israel suspendesse imediatamente a ofensiva em Rafah, no sul de Gaza. Como é que a África do Sul vê a situação atual? Como enfrentar tudo isso?
Well, South Africa went to the International Court because South Africa saw genocide happening and nobody was calling it genocide. And we decided to apply to expose this thing to the world. And since that time, there's been a lot of positive movement to enlighten the world about the genocide. The court itself has actually said, plausibly, there is a possibility that there's genocide happening there, but we need to investigate further. But they've put in place measures to tell Israel what to do and what not to do. And from that time on, South Africa has made further applications to try, especially on Rafah, to try and limit Israel's genocide continuing to happen unabated. And the court has agreed again with South Africa that no, Israel is actually defying and they continue to defy the international court. So what is positive about it is that Israel has been exposed. Right now there's an application to actually charge Netanyahu and his defense minister. That is a positive. What is also good about that is that it has not only exposed Israel and those that support Israel, but it has isolated Israel in the world. I mean, all around the world, there are many demonstrations that are actually against what Israel is doing. So it's a positive thing. And more work needs to be done, and more pressure needs to be put on Israel.
Agora, embaixador, o presidente dos Estados Unidos faz algumas críticas ao governo israelense, mas na prática continua a apoiar Israel, inclusive com armas. Como é que a África do Sul avalia isso?
No, what is good about that is that even in America there is a huge movement now that is against America supporting Israel. So the government of America itself is in trouble. It is in trouble at a time when it is actually going into elections. So there's a lot of mobilization, especially young people, the students, and so on and so forth in America that are against America supporting Israel. So South Africa views it in a positive light, that America itself is getting exposed.
Bom, e 30 anos depois do fim do apartheid, qual é o balanço que a África do Sul faz do país?
A lot has happened. A lot has been delivered by the government of the day. Of course, the first big delivery was that the black people in South Africa who were not allowed to vote before 1994, today are able to vote. But apart from that, there's been a lot of transformation. The government has built many houses for the poor people. The government today supports many people who are poor, who otherwise would not have been able to support themselves. Many students go to school and to universities without paying school fees. We can count a lot of things that have happened. So there's been great progress, but a lot still needs to happen.
Like what?
Because unemployment is still very high. Mm-hmm. The education is still not reaching everybody. There are people who are still poor in South Africa. There are still people who without houses and so on and so forth. So a lot of work still needs to happen. We still have a problem of crime in South Africa, and it arises because other people are not employed, because they are poor. So the government still has a lot to do.
And how is government dealing with it, with all these problems?
Well, it's a process. You see, for instance, educating a population is a process. It doesn't happen within 3 years, 5 years. It's a long process. You have to skill them. You have to give them the skills to be able to do things on their own. You have to take them to university. They've got to graduate and start businesses of their own or get proper employment. You have to build the infrastructure. You have to make electricity accessible to everybody. And that's a process if you do it throughout the year, because, I mean, if you do it throughout the country. Because in the past, many people had no access to some of this infrastructure we're talking about. So that is the process. These are the things that the government is dealing with.
O que faltou ao país para resolver esses problemas?
Brazil has been a democracy much more longer than us. But you still have unemployment, you still have inequality, you still have crime in Brazil and so on. You still have people staying in favelas and informal settlement. We face the same problem. And our democracy is even shorter than Brazil. So you'll appreciate that to do and deal with those things takes time for the government. And the things that the Brazilian government is doing to deal with those things are exactly the things that we also try and do.
O fluxo turístico entre o Brasil e a África do Sul tem bom volume? Pode ser aumentado?
In fact, the flow of tourism between South Africa and Brazil was very huge just before COVID. So when COVID struck, you remember that there were no flights between the two countries, and for a long time there were no direct flights between the two countries. You had to fly via other countries in Europe and in Africa before you get to South Africa if you are coming from Brazil. But now we've got two flights, in fact 3. And South Africa Airways flies both directly to Johannesburg and the other one flies directly to Cape Town. The volume of tourism has increased big time between the two countries. And it will continue to increase as more and more people get to know about the two countries. As South Africans get to know about Brazil, Brazilians get to know about South Africa.
Embaixador, que tipo de providências os brasileiros precisam tomar para visitar a África do Sul?
Nothing.
Nothing?
Nothing. You don't need a visa to go to South Africa. I mean, if you go as a tourist, you can go to South Africa and stay for 90 days without a visa, you know. So as a tourist, you usually don't need 90 days if you are going as a tourist. Perhaps the only other thing that you need is a yellow fever certificate, which if you come from Brazil, you go to South Africa, you need that. But overall, there's nothing much that you need. You need your money, you need your ticket, you need your passport, you need your yellow fever vaccination, and you need to book your hotel in South Africa or go on a safari.
And enjoy the country.
And enjoy the country. It's as simple as all that.
Agora, que lugares, cidades ou outros pontos turísticos o senhor recomenda aos brasileiros que querem visitar a África do Sul?
Well, for Brazilian, now understanding Brazilian, I mean, one of the things you must do if you go to South Africa, you must go on a safari. You know what a safari is?
Yeah, of course.
Yeah, of course.
I know.
You must go on a safari. We've got some of the biggest and most beautiful safari sites in South Africa. So that's one thing I'll recommend. And of course, another thing that you must do, go on the wine route in the Cape region and see the beauty of the country there, see the beauty of the wine plantations and so on and so forth. But there are many other things. The urban life, the nightlife is good. There are limitless things to see.
E que lugares do Brasil o senhor recomendaria aos turistas sul-africanos que queiram nos visitar?
Oh, there are many places in Brazil. I'll tell you about the places that I've visited.
Okay.
Because I went there because I want everybody else to visit. Of course, Rio. You must go. You have to go to Rio. For us coming from Africa, you have to go to Bahia. You know, Bahia is the place. You have to go to the Amazon.
What's your favorite one?
I've been to the Amazon.
Yeah.
It's difficult to say which is the favorite because they all give you different things. They don't give you one and the same thing. You have to see all of them and enjoy. You have to go to Curitiba. I enjoyed that city, and on that train ride, and in Parana and so on, it's very beautiful. I mean, Brazil is beautiful.
Muito obrigada pela entrevista, embaixador.
Thank you.
O Direito Sem Fronteiras chega ao fim, mas você pode conferir este e outros conteúdos pelo site da TV Justiça, pelo Instagram, Twitter, Spotify e YouTube. Basta acessar @Rádio e TV Justiça. Até a próxima. Tchau, tchau.